Well, hello everybody. It's great to be with you again today. Today I'm excited to share with you about a principle that I get asked about a lot in working with couples, and it's this: how can I tell if my partner is growing? So I look forward to sharing with you more about that today. Okay, this question. So how can you tell if your partner is growing? There's three major indicators that can help you understand if growth is happening with your partner. And it's important to understand these indicators because sometimes people can be too harsh or expect too little from their partner when it comes to growth. And I want to make sure that your expectations are realistic as you look for growth in the relationship with your partner. Now, the reason this topic matters is because change can be difficult, especially for behaviors that have been around for a really long time. Sometimes we're dealing with issues in our relationship that we're worried may never change with our partner. And that's a real possibility. Some people spend their whole lives trying to overcome difficulties, and some people are able to achieve very significant change quickly in their lives. And there's a lot of variables that impact how long something takes to get better. But certainly things that are compulsive. Compulsive just means something that I feel driven to do, that's a deep-rooted part of who I am, maybe has even been around in my life for a really long time. Those compulsive behaviors can be particularly difficult to overcome, and they can take some time. So these indicators are really helpful then in really managing your expectations when it comes to change in your partner and what to expect and look for if change is actually occurring. So let's get into it then. What are the three indicators that can help you know if your partner is changing? The first indicator is that the behavior ought to be less often. Now, even with the most significant troubles that a person's working through, if they're really putting in committed effort, and if they're getting the right kind of help, you should be able to notice a decline in the frequency of the behavior. It should be less often over time. Now, I said a couple of key things there, right? If they're really working hard to overcome the issue, and if they're getting the right kind of help. Because sometimes we can give our best efforts to overcoming an issue, and if we don't have the tools and the skills that we need to overcome that issue, it'll still continue to be a problem despite our best efforts. So there really has to be the humility and the openness to the right kind of help also. And those are two big important parts when it comes to this less often concept, right? You should be able to see over a period of time a decline in the frequency of that issue. An example of this is I was working with a couple where the husband was dealing with a pornography issue. He'd been struggling with pornography since his early childhood. And because he'd been struggling with pornography for so long, it was a compulsive behavior. In other words, it had made itself into his habits and in his thinking on a daily basis. It had been around for a long time and it was deeply ingrained in his way of being. He felt driven toward this pornography behavior, and it was very difficult for him to decline. So an issue like that isn't going to go away instantaneously for somebody. Even when they try to overcome it and put their best efforts in it, it's still going to be a struggle for them. It's going to be hard to overcome for them. And getting the right kind of help to support them is going to be extremely important in overcoming that issue. So we're looking for less often. If you look at that behavior over a 3-month span as the wife, she ought to be able to notice over a 3-month span that behavior is becoming less often in him. He is viewing pornography less often over a 3-month span. So if that behavior was happening every third day in a week, she ought to be able to notice that it's happening more like once a week, right? She should be able to see that gradual decline in the frequency of that behavior over time. So that's our first indicator, less often. Our second indicator is less severe. So what I mean by less severe is that the behavior ought to not go as deep as it typically would go in the past, right? If somebody's working on overcoming a very difficult behavior in their lives, you ought to be able to track how severe that behavior is over time. There should be gradual declines in the severity of the behavior. So an example of this is I was working with a couple where the wife had an issue with lying. She had been lying since she was a youth. She was raised in a family that had very severe punishments when somebody did something wrong. And she learned the strategy of being deceitful when she was young, when she would make mistakes. And she would be deceitful so that she could try to avoid these harsh punishments that were happening in her life when she was growing up. Well, fast forward now, she's an adult and she's in a marriage. And she's lying about things, some things that are very important and some things that are very meaningless in the relationship. She has this compulsive lying problem, and her husband's really struggling with trust, right? So as we're working on this lying issue, he ought to be able to see a decline in the severity of her lies over time. That's principle 2, right? So what I mean by a decline in the severity is he ought to be able to track that the types of lies that she's telling are less harmful on the relationship over time. He ought to be able to track that. They ought to be less severe over time. If she's really working on overcoming this issue, she's going to get rid of the really severe lying first and start to work on the smaller everyday lies second. So that principle of less severe. The third principle is quicker recovery, right? So what I mean by quicker recovery is in both these cases, the pornography and the lying, the spouses of these individuals ought to be able to tell over time that their partner is catching the behavior and recovering from it quicker. So that means they're coming to their spouse with honesty faster. They're catching themselves in their own compulsive behaviors quicker. They're gaining insight and awareness into those behaviors that help them overcome them faster. They're being more humble. They're taking accountability sooner. They ought to be able to track these things in the relationship. That's the quicker recovery, right? Their awareness into the issue, their ability to stop the issue, their ability to be accountable or make amends of that issue in the relationship. We ought to be able to see that quicker recovery over time. So those are the 3 principles: less often, less severe, quicker recovery. Those are the 3 things that you ought to be able to tell when you're measuring progress in your partner. And if you are also working on issues in the relationship, that's how you'll be able to tell with yourself as well. You ought to be experiencing the behavior less often. It ought to be less severe, and you should have a quicker recovery over time. Now, let's rewind back to the beginning of this video. I told you 2 things, right, that are required to kind of see that type of progress in yourself or in the relationship. The first one is my best efforts to grow and overcome the issue. The second is that I'm getting the right kind of help. Because even when I put my best efforts into a behavior that I want to change or grow or progress in, if I'm not getting the right kind of help, if I'm not open to the right kind of help, I may continue to lack the skills, the abilities, and the support that I need to overcome that really difficult issue, right? So don't be afraid to get help. And if your partner is continuing to struggle with the same thing over and over and you feel like they really are trying hard, there's a good chance they just don't have the right kind of help to overcome that issue. And if they're willing to get the right kind of help, it will increase their probability for change over time. Now, a final thought. I want you to know that in the years that I've spent working with individuals and couples, there are very few instances that people haven't been able to overcome the things that they've wanted to with the right kind of effort and the right kind of support, right? I want you to know that I believe in the ability that people have to grow beyond their imagination. And certainly I've watched so many couples improve really difficult dynamics in their relationship when both are willing to be humble, committed, work hard, and overcome those obstacles. So I believe in the power of people to change, right? And there are very few things that we can't grow beyond if we're willing to put in those best efforts and get the right kind of help. So I hope these principles are helpful to you. Look for those in yourself. Look for those in your partner. If you're wondering if change is happening, look for the behavior to be less often, less severe, with a quicker recovery. As always, it's great being with you again today. I hope these principles are helpful to you, and I look forward to being with you again soon. Take care.